Here's everything you need to know about Sony's latest camera, the Sony a7C II. Okay, so the Sony a7C II is very much consistent with the recent releases of the Sony range, in that it's a camera that's geared towards more content creators and has a more simplistic design, but still with advanced capabilities. This camera in particular, when you look at it, does have a very clean design. It's sort of stripped things back a bit, neating everything up a little bit, so it's a lot less intimidating to sort of look at. And in addition to that, it still does have all those advanced capabilities. So first off, the Sony a7C II is a much more cleaner and slick design compared to a lot of other cameras. When you look at it, everything is very cleanly laid out, and it also has this nice looking little chrome finish to it. So if you want something that looks good as well as shoots good, well, this is the camera for you. Now, I naturally did compare this with the Sony a7 III, which I do shoot quite a lot of photos with. And what I found is that the Sony a7 III and the Sony a7C II are very similar in design, with the Sony a7C II having a few less buttons and a cleaner layout. The grips are also fairly the same, and they're also fairly compact and narrow and easy to pack away. In terms of weight, the cameras are actually fairly different, with the Sony a7 III weighing roughly 640 grams and the Sony a7C II weighing about 514 grams. So you are getting a camera that's actually lighter and performs even better than the Sony a7 III. With this dial, you don't have a bunch of superfluous sort of modes on this dial. It's very much stripped back to the bare essentials. So you have your M, S, A, P modes, as well as 3 custom modes. But if you look at this dial here, you find you have a secondary dial. This secondary dial switches between the 3 primary modes that you would use this camera for. So you have your slow and quick, your movie, and your photography mode. So if you want to shoot in aperture priority mode in the camera mode and just the camera mode, all you have to do is simply flick the secondary dial to the camera mode and then flick your dial to your aperture mode. This is great, as now you can even have sort of pre-custom mode settings for these 3 particular modes. Whereas with other cameras, you might be a bit limited by simply switching to that mode and having to stay within the limitations of that mode. So I like this dial. So something you will notice about this camera is that the viewfinder is actually to the far left of the camera's body. Now typically when I work with cameras, the viewfinder is more in the center, and that's how I like it. But what I did find when using this camera is I could actually really press my eye right up against the viewfinder and not worry about having my nose pressed up against the screen, as I do have a big honker. So it was nice to have a viewfinder that sort of positioned itself in a way that, you know, the rest of my face was comfortably placed. And the monitor on this camera is a very standard monitor among the Sony range. It's a flip screen, so it's great for selfie content and quick adjustments. Another thing I like about this monitor, it has adopted what more recent Sony cameras have adopted, in that it's a much more cleaner and more understandable layout on the camera menu. Okay, so Sony seems to understand that a lot of us really hate using tripods, so naturally they've developed the stabilization inside this camera. This camera has 5-axis 7-step image stabilization, and in addition to that, it also has internal algorithms inside the camera to correct any shakes. So naturally, when you are using the active stabilization in this camera, you will find that the imagery has been cropped in slightly. But it is a very reliable form of stabilization for those of us that absolutely hate using a tripod on the go. Now personally, I only like using internal stabilization on cameras for more static sort of shots, but I did test out a bit of panning and tilting with this camera, and I found that with some little bits of panning and little bits of tilting, this camera was actually very reliable when it came to its stabilization. So I'm here on Bondi Beach right now, and the sun has just passed. It's about 5:20. So the video here is about 4K resolution with a color profile of 422 at 10-bit. It has some great colors coming out of it, and typical to Sony, it's also very good in the low light that I have right now. It looks absolutely beautiful looking at the screen right here. Should have brought a tripod because my hand's shaking like crazy, but I've got the image stabilization on, and that should be helping me out. Just swapped hands just then to fix it up a bit. But all in all, you have some very beautiful colors coming out of this Sony camera. Personally, I find the colors in this camera a lot richer than other cameras I've had to work with in the past. I'm gonna require not as much post-production work to really bring out the colors in the images I take here, and it's It's a beautiful looking shot. I mean, that being said, it also helps to have good lighting in a good location. But otherwise, I am really quite happy with the quality of the video here. It's quite beautiful, and you could honestly make a little movie out of this sort of camera. So if you're someone that shoots a lot of content for phones or devices that only demand a HD quality, it's great to have a camera that can shoot very rich colors and also give you the option to crop in post. Now, Sony does have an incredibly good reputation for very reliable autofocus, and the Sony a7C II is no different. With this camera, you're getting face detection autofocus. But what's a particular note about the face detection autofocus in this camera is that when compared to the A7RV, that only covers 79% of the sensor. But with this camera, you're getting 94% of the sensor fully covered. This means you have more points on the sensor to grab autofocus from. And I'm happy to hear that this camera has AI algorithms inside the camera body. This means the camera has skeletal algorithms and human pose estimations inside the camera, making this camera that much smarter in terms of identifying human subjects. But of course, you can also identify your obligatory animals, birds, and vehicles. The autofocus in this camera is also a lot more persistent than what some of you might be used to. As with this camera, if there's something in the foreground, if it's already locked onto your human subject, it will make a very active effort to stay locked onto that subject. So if you're worried about a bit of foreground ruining your shot and throwing out the focus completely, provided you've already locked on focus onto your subject, the camera will stay fixed focus on your subject. There might occasionally be a little brief bit of where it loses that autofocus, but it's really quick to grab that autofocus again. And also, if you have a particular subject, such as a bride and groom, or a reoccurring subject in, say, your vlogs, such as yourself, you can save a face to the camera and have the camera identify that face and seek that face out when it comes to autofocus. Meaning that if you're at a wedding shooting the bride and groom, you don't have to worry about the camera randomly grabbing someone in the crowd. It will keep its autofocus on the important subject. Something I noticed about the autofocus on this camera while shooting birds in particular is that the autofocus would actually lock on to the bird's eye, and it would stay there in a very efficient manner, almost as if it was locking onto a human's eye. So if you want to shoot a whole lot of bird photography or videography, this is a great camera for its autofocus alone. So there you have it, that's the Sony a7C II. Now, I really like this camera in terms of its design. It's a very cleanly laid out design and very easy to use, but I also reckon that in terms of stabilization, autofocus, and color profiling, this camera really did excel for its price range. The stabilization did a great job, and I was happy to see that I could do a little bit of panning and tilting with the in-body stabilization inside this camera. The color profile in this camera was absolutely fantastic. There was a whole lot more detail and variety of colors in the imagery, so I really was getting some much more richer and more unique looking shots when I was using this camera. And I absolutely love the autofocus on this camera. The use of AI algorithms along with the face detection, which is significantly more improved, means that this camera is very smart and very strong when it comes to its autofocus. So this is very much a camera that I can rely on if I have to, say, shoot in very busy situations. All in all, if you want a camera that's sleek and simple in its design, but also excels at all the most important departments when it comes to your photography and videography, then the Sony a7C II is a great camera to reach for. So that's the Sony a7C II. Let me know what you think about this camera in the comments below. Also, if you have a Sony a7C, I'd love to know how you think this camera in particular compared to that previous model.